All right, your time has expired, and we're going to ask you to come back so that we can learn a little bit about what you've been talking about in your conversations. So how many people sort of found that the amount of time was so, how many people follow the directions all the way through by raise of hands? Everybody did it? Okay, great, congratulations, good. You're good at following directions. That's right. You get the comfort of knowing that you were able to comply with instructions even if you're a rule breaker, which I typically am, right? So you might be that way too. What are some of the things that you talked about in your conversations with your partner? Were there some common themes that came up or things that are just at top of mind that interested you about what you heard from your partner?
Well, I learned something about the city, and I learned something about, I told her about her mother, how she came up here. Your grandmother came up here with 13 kids by herself, a widow, and amazing. I told her she sounded like Ruth or somebody from the Bible, you know. My God, how could you do it? But she did it. But just learning about where she was raised and the population where she was raised that I did not know about Northwest Detroit area, and her going to school with primarily Polish folks singing in the choir. So I was educated by her story, which was nice.
Great. Was it Hamtramck by any chance, or near?
A lot of people came from there. It was Northwest Detroit. Okay. There was the old Polish neighborhood that had come from Michigan Avenue in the Junction area, and they all kind of relocated to this little conclave.
Oh, all right.
Oh, it's my turn.
Please, sure, if you'd like to, yes.
Well, I learned that Dee went to Wayne State, and I also went to Wayne State undergrad, and we basically are almost from the same segment of time within the 60s and early 70s when we were there. And she had a very protective father, just like mine was, who would not let me go away to college because Mexican girls that aren't married do not leave the house. So that's kind of a cultural thing that I learned that we probably have in common in the families, and how her dad was a dad for all the kids in the neighborhood, which was kind of a changing neighborhood, but nonetheless he was a father figure. And you learn so much that families really mean a lot to, in many instances, even though sometimes you may have a dysfunctional one, it's still your family. And you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family.
There you go. Yeah. You have a highlight to share, that's fine. Not you can pass it up.
Well, Jeff and I know each other before, so I know a little bit about him, but it was interesting to hear about some of his his experiences and the way that where he grew up at and some of the experiences just in a small kind of area of the city between your experiences at Cranbrook and others where he had opportunities to have interactions with other races and how he relished in those and understood the diversity and cherished those experiences and how it helped kind of form him and reinforce his parents' belief about respect for all.
We did know each other from before, which is easy to work with each other. I know Kyle's married to a Caucasian lady, and I didn't know that he came from a mixed marriage. So his barriers were right there day one. He said walking through the mall, sometimes people see a white lady walking with 3 black kids, get the stairs and everything. He said it really didn't bother him. And I don't know how I would have felt. So just like I think that when you go through life and let things roll off your shoulders a little bit. He's a pretty laid back guy. I don't know what I would have done, but I'd probably stare back at him. I said, yeah, that's my mom. Here you go.
Thank you. First, I think it's interesting the way you structured the questions, because when I think about it, where I grew up kind of shaped the way that I view everything else. So stand out. Your home base, where you start, is everything. But what I did find interesting, because for question number 3, I feel like I wasn't really sure. Like, I always knew that I was different, or, being black is a different experience. But to be honest with you, if I have to go all the way, because I told her toy store maybe, but really church. In my experience, church is what taught me, and I think that's very interesting, especially based on Malcolm X's statement is that Sunday morning at noon is the most segregated hour in the country.
Well, for me, my experience is going to be a bit different than most of you because I grew up in Damascus. So when you ask, what kind of neighborhood? Well, my neighborhood was diverse, but the diversity was a very old diversity. Damascus is the cradle of civilizations. We have every color, race, religion. My neighborhood was mostly Sunni Muslims, but I went to school with Christians and everybody else. So, that, and it was never talked about. We're all Syrians, so that was not an issue. But teachers, the first time I experienced, a different race teacher was when I came to this country and went to Wayne State. So we have more Wayne State graduates here. And when did I experience, first time I felt, it happened gradually. When I came here, I was just trying to deal with becoming, the culture shock and the language barrier and all of that. So it was gradual. And I was sharing with Lee, who, by the way, is the most positive person I've ever met. I want to be like next to her all the time. When we first came to this country, my husband and I, our second year, we lived in Harper Woods, which is right next to Grosse Pointe. And I remember people in Grosse Pointe would say, oh, Grosse Pointe is such a great city. It's wonderful. They don't sell to African American. They don't sell to black. Not like Southfield. And at the time, I had only been here in the country for 2 years. I'm like, well, it is what, I didn't even think about it. I didn't even think that, that I should have objections to that. And with time, I became more horrified. I'm like, oh my God, how can they even say that? How can they think or, think that and then to have the guts to say it? That, to me, that's horrifying. But it's something, that experience came gradually. And now I belong to a group of people that I'm finding are becoming, the next, we have been, but more so now, where, I'm considered white. As far as the U.S. Census, I'm white. But once I open my mouth or they hear my name, I'm no longer white. I don't have those privileges. I'm profiled. I'm, all those things. No fault of my own or my children, but that's how it is. So, yeah, these issues are very close to my heart.
Would you like to go next?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. All right. First of all, are there any Central Michigan graduates? Here we go. 2 versus 2. Wayne State. Oh. You would do that, wouldn't you? You wouldn't do that. Fire up chips. We've enjoyed each other's, well, at least I enjoyed it. We've enjoyed each other's company. We have some similar child rearing. In particular, to our parents, we both found that neither of our parents really impressed upon us the need to learn the native language first, myself Spanish, Japanese with you. And parents do what parents do. I took it from a standpoint of we lived in a predominantly Caucasian community. My parents wanted us to assimilate. I have 3 brothers. The oldest one is, if you look at him, he has the darker skin. And so you could tell he was Mexican American. The 3 of us are more lightly complected, so you couldn't tell. But we never grew up talking about how races were different as much as you treated people the same. And so it wasn't really until for us, college is when you got exposed to a lot of the cultures. And it was there that myself, I wanted to learn more about my culture, my background, and got more involved with organizations like the Hispanic Student Organization, things of that nature. but not just leave it there, learn about other people's culture, not only just African American or from other countries, but also just anybody that you could learn from, Caucasians or anybody around this table. You just learn from it. So my last comment would be, in college, a lot of people don't look up when they're walking towards their campus. But if someone caught their eye, I would say, hello, and they would say hello back. It's the same thing with eating. I hated eating alone. So if I saw someone sitting by themselves, I would just say, I hate eating alone. Do you mind if I sit next to you? And they would always be very accept the invitation, and I'd learn from those folks. So just like we were here learning today, I've always said I'm always open to learning more and more about people. So appreciate this dialogue you've encouraged here.
Well, I'll just echo that we've had a lovely conversation and did find a lot of similarities in our parents wanting us to grow up and be American and fit in and not learn the language and so I think we both are very accepting of other people and very interested in everybody, no matter what race, no matter what their background is. It's just it's almost like an equality that you just were brought up to feel that way about other people. So I think he summarized it very well. So thanks.
Well, thank you. You can just set that down. So Basha mentioned something, and some of you have talked about school and how that's been one of the places that you've had a connection to. Basha, I think... Russia. I'm so sorry. That's okay. My eyes need checking. Fine. There you go. Right. But one of the things you mentioned is that you remember having a professor of color when you went to Wayne, right? So let's just probe for that for a minute. On that particular question, is there anybody who never had a teacher of color in their entire career? Okay, all right, or a teacher of a race different than your own? Okay, so if that's the case, let's just talk about that for just a minute and why that might be, all right? What are some of the things that are really important about teachers, first of all? Role models in the classroom, right? Other things. Pardon? Level of education, right? Mm-hmm. That's true, right? You have to be credentialed, right?
Including college in this question?
You can include college. You can think about it from, preschool on up.
I would make a comment that was hard because at Michigan State, it's a big university,
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of teaching assistants, a lot of time they're foreign.
Mm-hmm.
They're really hard to understand.
Hmm.
To not.
Hmm.
Just spending all this money, they can't understand what they're saying. It makes it's already hard enough for me to learn personally, let alone, and it's just very difficult. And I think bigger universities have that issue everywhere.
And was that your first experience with a teacher that was of a different race when you were at Michigan State? Okay, all right, okay.
First one I couldn't understand what you're saying.
All right, okay. What are other important aspects of teachers? Sensitivity, character. What do you hope your teachers will provide for your children? Compassion.
A good education.
Good education.
Instruction. Good instruction.
Right? Okay. So some of the other things that you might expect are, not cutting down their dreams, but actually helping them expand their own concept of who they can be, because just like when we talked this morning about sometimes taking some measured risks with people and seeing them in different roles, not seeing them in limited roles, encouraging them to dream, encouraging them to have aspirations, encouraging them to get along with others in the classroom. And that's one of the first places we all entrust is school, to help inculcate those really important values. So if that's really important, is it important that children of color actually see teachers of color in the classroom? Right, okay. absolutely important. Is that important for white children too, in terms of their academic performance, to see teachers of color in the classroom? Right, okay. So anybody who's involved in education knows that that actually has been shown to have a positive impact for all children, seeing teachers of color in the classroom. It has positive impact on average or annual yearly performance, actually boosts the performance of the entire classroom. And yet, today we have about, 15% teachers of color nationally. 15%, right? Mm-hmm. Nationally.
What's the percentage of African-American students nationally?
Offhand, I'd say I'm not really sure about that. I know for the population as a whole, it's somewhere about 13%, right? So I'm not really sure, though, in terms of the proportionate share, what that is in the classroom. But one of the things we need to think about is when you think about where there are concentrations of children of color, there may not be, significant concentrations of teachers of color. Sometimes there are. Chicago, I think, might be an example of that. Detroit might be. But we know that we have a challenge here. Can anybody remember a time where we had roughly a proportionate number of teachers by race for students in this country? Okay. Think back before 1954. Brown versus Board of Education, right? So, before Brown, you had completely segregated education, right? We had Latino teachers teaching Latino students, Indian teachers teaching Indian students, black teachers teaching black students. Ne'er the twain shall meet, right? Complete segregation. Now, after Brown, you have separate but equal struck down in education. And you have school systems integrating. But what happened to all the black teachers? What happened to all of the Latino teachers? They didn't have jobs, right? Exactly. School systems made a critical choice. They decided to leave teachers of color on the sidelines, and they didn't hire teachers of color, but they did integrate classrooms. And so one of the implications of that decision, you think about this from an implementation perspective, is that it took generations to develop skill and ability and some connections with others, to inspire other people to teach. And that was lost through that decision. Now, that's not to say that Brown wasn't very important, all right? I hope the thing you're not taking away from this is that we should bemoan the Brown case, because one of the things that it did is it definitely proved that separate but equal is not equal. And there are far more pathways now through education to get to career building and getting the life that you want. But it is an important note in terms of implementation about what we need to pay attention to if we ignore race, right? So we're going to move on and start talking about some other concepts, but that's one of the important aspects of things that explains why things are the way they are. It was really good to hear some of the other themes that came up in your discussions. And we'll continue having some of those discussions throughout the day. So, right now what we're going to do is talk about, remember those three sort of pillars that we talked about early on? One of them was normalization, the other was organization, and then there was also operationalizing. We're going to talk about normalizing for a bit, and we're going to start off with a concept that is pretty foundational for our work. And it's the difference between equity and equality. And we take time to just use a device to really explain this, because we tend to use the words the same. I mean, I can plead guilty to that myself. First, we'll start with just a few points about why we lead with race. First of all, we know that racial inequities have been pervasive. We know that they have been here since the country started. So focusing on race is really an important aspect for our work, even though we know that there are some very important intersectionalities, right? When you were talking about your experience working in unions or working in DTE, where there was basically a policy and a practice around limiting women's career pathways if they decided to get married, that's a very serious wrong, right? I mean, plus the fact that up until about 1967, single women working with income typically didn't have access to credit cards. That was just accepted, right? There are other intersectionalities around gender, around sexual identity, all types of things that are really important, but race is the one that overwhelmingly amplifies those. So if you're thinking about who's usually at the bottom in terms of income, in terms of access to opportunity with any of those intersectionalities, race amplifies that. Racial anxiety is on the rise. The fact that we haven't been talking about race a lot, unless there's an emergency, right, means that we usually ignore it. And when we ignore it, we don't really have it at top of mind when we're thinking about policies, when we're thinking about practices, and when we're thinking about how we can actually begin to make some change in our society. The fact that we don't talk about it a lot and actually have some avoidance in talking about race because we don't have a common way of talking about it means that it continues to be a challenge. The institutional and structural approach that we learn from focusing on race to create better outcomes for everyone is something that can be used when we're addressing sexism, we're addressing ageism, all of the other isms that we face. And we welcome using those tools in that way. But being very specific, getting back to the specificity of race is extremely important because even when we do things like say, oh, we'd like to address economic opportunity or economic inequality, when you start taking a look at the data, if you were just to develop programs around economic inequality and not pay attention to race, you're probably going to come up with programs that ignore race and miss the opportunity to really focus your energy where there is the most opportunity to create some change. It's the same thing with health as well. So in terms of getting back to equity and equality and what's the difference, I want you to think about the last time that you were at a big event. Do we still have a Michigan State Fair? Okay, we do? All right. So last time you may have been at a Lions game, Tigers game, a Meadowbrook. They still have concerts at Pine Knob. DTE Energy? Okay, all right, great. I'm dating myself. So you inevitably at some point had to get up and use the restroom, right? There's a break in the proceedings. And so when you think about this, 51% of the population is women, 49% of the population is men. We have equal facilities for both in terms of there being restrooms for men and women, right? But I want to ask women, how is the experience different for you in a crowded space with access to those facilities? What's one key difference? Much longer waiting lines, okay? Unless you go to a union meeting. That's right. Okay. That's right.
No wait at all.
That's right. Okay. So in terms of that waiting experience, about how much would you estimate the wait is longer, women, those of you who have been waiting in that line? About how much longer than for women than for men? 15, 20 minutes longer, right? Which could be, 3 times as long, maybe, all right? Let me ask, so the men who have women in your lives who have to wait in those long lines, is your life in any way negatively impacted by that? What are you doing while you're waiting for the women in your lives to come back from the restroom? You really are a troublemaker. All right. So let's ask this then. Might there be some elders who are with women who might be inconvenienced? Might there be small gatherings of children who are unattended in large public spaces who are also being impacted by this, right? So there's a price that we all pay, right, for having a long line to the restroom. And most of the men here in this room don't want to admit that they're usually the ones who are holding purses and garments and other types of things while you're waiting for the woman in your life to get back from the restroom, right? But at any rate, you know, if we really wanted to address this as a design problem, what are some of the things that jurisdictions are doing? What are some of the things you've seen to begin to decrease that?
Open up a new arena.
Uh-huh.
Interesting story to share with everybody. So on the suite level, we did not put bathrooms in the suite. They interviewed women. The women said they preferred going to another area not within the suite. I'm not going to say why. I'm not going to say why, but that's until they designed it so there's a common area for the men and women's bathrooms on the suite level. On the lower concourse, they made more stalls for women, so it would try to even it out.
Right.
And that was through group because they can see the show longer, and the less they're in line there, the more they're buying food and beverages and things like that. So it was a business decision as well.
There you go. So you have a business decision to have more stalls designated for women. Other things that you're seeing in public spaces? Okay.
Unisex bathrooms.
Unisex bathrooms, that's right.
Or family bathrooms.
Family bathrooms is another one, that's right. Okay. So I don't know if you're seeing this at Detroit Metro, but at Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, there are bathrooms that have signs that have been switched at peak periods from being double loading, one side men, one side women, to being both sides women, right, at certain gates to alleviate, you know, the long lines. And that's a design solution that works too. So for all of these solutions, would we have been able to get there if we didn't focus on gender? Gender, right. We wouldn't be able to get there if we hadn't done that. So what's important about that is when we talk about this example, it's not just about the access, which is usually what equality is about. It's usually about access to resources. The equity is also about, and more importantly, about the experience of accessing that opportunity. And that's important to keep in mind as we think about our work too, because the equality aspect of things often ends up being almost theoretical. Yeah, theoretically, yes, you could graduate from high school, apply to, you know, a Big Ten university and get in. And in terms of thinking about the opportunity and what's required to meet the requirements, you may be attending a school district that is going to not necessarily advance you in doing that. And that might not come about because of anything that you did. It might have to do entirely with all of the racialized decisions that have gone into how our society is structured. So, the other thing that I want to just point out is that as we begin to understand all of the different ways that gender is represented and manifests itself, that's changing how we have this conversation about gender designation for restrooms altogether, right? And calling that into question.
So one of the things that I noticed as we were going through our laying it on the line exercise, when we got to the statement about merit, do you guys remember that? There were quite a few statements where we said, everything else equal. Do people remember kind of saying that? If everything else is equal, then that was kind of our way of getting to how we would define merit and what we would sort of place on it, what our qualifiers were. And I just wanted to bring that up as we think about this next section, which is related to racial inequity, because all else is not equal, right? So across every single indicator for success or quality of life, we see racial inequity, whether it is from birth to death, from infant mortality to life expectancy within education, employment, housing, all of those things we can see racial disparities. And so for us, racial equity means that race no longer predicts how well you'll do in life. That's how we define racial equity. And it isn't just about closing the gaps, it's making sure that everyone is better off, that everyone is doing well. And so I'm thinking about education in particular. We certainly don't want to only focus on closing the gaps, because when we look at the world, we're behind the rest of the world, right? So we don't want to just close the gaps. We want to make sure that we're all better off and that we're all achieving more. And so in order to do that, we have to target strategies that focus on improvements for those who are worse off, who have been impacted the most by those inequitable practices and inequitable policies. And then we have to move beyond just services and programs and really look at systems change and policy change. And how do we direct strategies towards systems and policies? Because programs are great, but programs aren't how we got here. Policies are how we got to where we are. So we really have to focus on that. And Gordon is going to take us through the next set.
So just offhand, I'll just mention that when it comes to having conversations with people about why racial equity is so important, one of the key aspects of this slide is really, this is, sort of the foundation of the case statement. As long as race continues to have an outsized impact on how well you do in American society, we need to address race, right? In order to ensure that it doesn't remain that. And I say that to you because I'm doing some work with elected officials in the Twin Cities now. And that continually comes up as one of the challenges that they're facing, because they realize that they're in this stewardship role of in some ways being almost not necessarily front line to the public, but being in a public space, in a representative space where they are really, in the place of the public, trying to communicate on a regular basis what's important about the work of organizations that are taking this on. So we're going to talk about bias for just a minute. And how many people anybody here had any implicit bias training or had bias training at their job or anything like that? Okay. All right. So the important thing about that is that we all have bias, right? We all have biases. It's part of how we are wired as humans. There are things that we're attracted to and things that we are repelled by, right? Where does that come from? Some of it comes from our culture. Some of it comes from our entertainment and literature. Other aspects of it come from who we are and our family. But we're all hardwired with biases. They help us negotiate the world. They can help us, negotiate it quite successfully in many cases. But when we talk about bias and we start applying that to large groups of people based upon some characteristic that they share, that's where it becomes very harmful, right? So acting on bias can turn into discrimination when we start avoiding people, keeping them from opportunity, and othering them, actually having them not be able to play a full role in our society based upon their race. Explicit bias and implicit bias. So you may have heard me talk about the fact that we were going to focus on implicit institutional bias today. Well, explicit is exactly like what it sounds. There is no question about the bias that is being presented. It is usually presented with some malice aforethought. That means that somebody intends to hurt somebody, all right? It's very direct. The person who has the bias in that case is aware that they have the bias and all too willing, right, to express it in a way where it is going to be harmful to somebody. And it can have group implications as well as individual implications. So that example there about a sign of a window in an apartment building that says whites only, there was a time in our country, there was a time in Detroit where that was the case, right? Where a property owner or somebody renting public property could say, whites only allowed here. Now, that time does not exist anymore, but when we think about implicit bias, right, it's against the law now to have the whites only. Implicit is it's significantly different because it's expressed indirectly. There usually is not a direct intention there to harm someone or to harm a group. The person who has the bias may be unaware that they have the bias, and when confronted with the fact that they have a bias, which usually can be determined through looking at some data, right? They'll probably deny it. I'll connect this in just a minute. So, for example, one of the stories that Julie tells, just through her experience of having been the civil rights director in Seattle for a number of years, is there were complaints that arose about a couple of properties and property owners who didn't seem to want to rent to people of color. Now, they would have the fair housing symbol in the window and certainly talk to people about renting, but the experience of a black renter or a brown renter was vastly different. Somebody might be told on the phone that, there's 2 or 3 apartments that are available. We got a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom, and we've got an efficiency. And then when they show up, all of a sudden, there's only an efficiency, right? All of a sudden, there may be some new criteria that go along with the application. So an additional background check that you didn't hear about before you came. A white person who showed up might be told that there were more apartments available, and there may be some discrepancies in terms of pricing, right, in terms of what the rent actually costs. So the only way you can really determine this is to really have some mixed pairs go out and do some testing. And the data came back and showed that there were some discrepancies, and the only factors seemed to be race. When confronted with this reality, several of those, how do you think the property owners and the property managers responded? When they were told that there seems to be a problem in the way that you're treating people based on their race, here's the data that we have.
It's not true.
Right. They flatly denied it. Some were offended, right? Others, very embarrassed by it. But one of the ways of beginning to unravel this is to ensure that everyone's experience of renting an apartment is normalized. And so you use checklists, and the checklists begin to document whether or not you're following the practices that ensure that everyone has access to an opportunity to rent, right? So, any questions about the explicit or implicit? Because that implicit is in many ways completely unintended, right? People may not know that they're doing the type of bias that they have. And we should say that there's a lot of work being done on bias to understand how our hidden brain actually helps us make decisions, sometimes in ways that are not necessarily the ways we intended. But if you have bias, I think that one of the things about the implicit bias training that's come up, next slide, is knowing that if you try to be aware of your biases, particularly those that are deep-seated, it's not that you'll never be able to address them. Probably the best way to know if you have a bias and address it is to have somebody else make decisions about the thing you're biased about. But suppressing it or denying it has a tendency to amplify it in the work that you're doing. Openly acknowledging and challenging biases, though, and even understanding that we could have bias in our decision-making processes opens us up to be free to explore how we can actually get beyond that. So that leads us to how we start using some tools to create some different outcomes. So we've been talking about theory in terms of these concepts, but you, of course, are interested in, okay, so how do you make a difference in an institutional background? Next slide. Or would you like me to go with this one? Sure. All right. So this is really 4 quadrants, right? And you've got institutional and explicit, institutional and implicit, and then individual and explicit, and individual and implicit. And we're going to see this in a slightly different way on the next slide, just arrayed in more of a linear fashion. And these are important definitions, too, in terms of how we begin to have this conversation about race for a purpose. So with the institute, well, and let me just say this, that these examples come from policing, and we all know that policing has had a spotlight shined on it over the past, let's say about the past 5 or 6 years now. But let me ask you this, has the rate of shootings of officers, by officers of black men, has that increased statistically over time? Is that happening more now, about the same, or less, do you think?
I think about the same.
It's about the same. You take a look at,
We see it now, that's all.
yeah, exactly.
Media
That's
allows
exactly
you to
it.
see it more.
People got one of these. I think.
There you go. Everybody has a broadcast network in their pocket.
Otherwise, it never would have happened.
So it's important that we keep that in mind. You know, I think that but one of the reasons there's a lot more of a spotlight on it is because we're seeing more of it because of the cameras. But statistically, it's about the same. These examples come out of police officers' work in Seattle. Seattle had gone through a pretty significant incident about 7 or 8 years ago, where there were some pretty explicit personal things being said by officers during arrests. And I think it's safe to say this probably happens to a certain degree in every jurisdiction. But under the institutional and explicit policies which explicitly discriminate against a group. So there may have been a time, or there certainly was a time in America where a police department could refuse to hire a person of color, right, legally. And that wouldn't go challenged. Now, thanks to changes in our law brought about by demands by people, that is no longer the case. If you were to see this happening today, your best course of action would be to have a lawsuit, right? But at the institutional and implicit level, policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally, so a police department focusing on street-level drug arrests is a perfect example of the intersection of public policy and departmental practice. So let's think about this for a bit. Here's another little pop quiz for you. In terms of drug usage, who uses drugs more? Black people or people of color or white people?
White people?
White people use drugs marginally, a bit more. Sometimes it depends on the drug, right? But more. In terms of people who sell drugs, more black people and people of color or more white people?
About the same, maybe?
About the same, but marginally more white people, right? However, there may be some data collection bias here because let's think about this for a minute. Where do white people typically sell drugs? Not that anybody here would know.
CVS.
Okay. So let's just say that one of the things that you've pointed out, though, is that there are significant checklists and guards in place to guard against people picking up other people's prescriptions and things like that, right? Within a pharmacy. You're not in the pharmacy. I am. You are? Okay. But overprescribing, right, is part of the challenge we're facing around the opioid crisis, as well as controlling access to opioids. And I'm telling you this in part because we just went through an incident where somebody said they picked up my wife's drugs, and it wasn't her and it wasn't me. But there was a camera there to capture who did. So that's part of the challenge, right?
Happens and it's going
Yes.
At this point, legally, somebody can pick up somebody else.
That is absolutely correct, right?
Why should we be inconvenienced to have, not be able to have somebody too anyhow?
Exactly,
Yeah.
but I mean, do you have to call
If you're
me
sick,
and
why do you
tell
wanna go to the
me
drugstore?
and that, you know,
Right.
that person can pick up your prescription, or is it okay if you just send someone? I mean, that's gonna become an
Yes, for ID, that's all.
So that's not something that's policed, right? Okay. Other places where drugs get sold.
School.
School, country club? Yeah, club, all right. Health clubs, right? Okay. Schools, parties, dorms, bars, usually out of the view
Jail.
of the public, right? Yes. Unfortunately, jail as well. Now, where do people of color typically traffic drugs?
What was the question?
Where do people of color typically traffic drugs? Streets, okay, all right. Now, of course, you know, there will be some anomalies here, right? But, you know, if most of the enforcement is taking place at the street level, and it's important, right, that happened, because in the neighborhood I grew up in, I'm sure some of you may have had the same experience. If you have an open drug market in your neighborhood, any place, that is not something that can thrive, right? Because it brings with it a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. So you definitely want police to be active there. But we need to acknowledge the fact that if that's the only place where we're doing policing, right, that will lead to the results that we have right now, where you may have 90% of the people in prison on a drug charge being people of color, and maybe only 10% who are white. So that's built into our system, right? At the individual and explicit prejudice in action, discrimination. So an officer using a racial slur when arresting someone. This actually did happen in Seattle. At the individual and implicit, this is where practices begin to come in, not necessarily policies. A police officer calling for backup more often when stopping a person of color. Or the City of New York stop and frisk policy, okay? Where an individual officer, it is the law, but they make the determination as to whether or not somebody will be stopped and frisked based upon their idea of who is most likely to be carrying a weapon. So those unconscious attitudes and beliefs are what are at play here. Now here's an opportunity for you to think about examples the Michigan Civil Rights Commission can actually influence, right? In terms of the institutional and explicit, so practices and policies that may be taking place at an institutional level that you think you might be able to have an impact on, institutional and implicit, unintended negative impacts on communities of color or people of color, and where you might have some impact on that. Individual and explicit, this is pretty clear. This is usually where people end up in HR, right? Yeah. At the individual and explicit. But then the individual and implicit, unintended consequences from somebody's behaviors or actions. Yes. Yes, certainly.
In the institutional and explicit, you may want to think about past policies, because there shouldn't be any institutional explicit policies right now, because that would be illegal. So it may help you to think about what might have been some former policies, maybe things that we saw in the film today, to list there to help you move into what Gordon just talked about within the institutional and implicit section. Does that make sense? Okay.
Why don't we give you about 5 minutes to connect with one other person at the table about these 4 categories. This is really just to provide an opportunity for thinking about where the commission might have the most reach.
Starting now.
Okay. And if it would be helpful, we can go back to the previous example too to show you what those examples were. Go for it. Okay, let's see how you did with these examples. who would like to share one of the examples they have for institutional and explicit? An example, top of mind, anything.
I know.
Yes.
So our example was education and working from left to right. Again, you don't see this now, but we could have whites only being able to teach, or females only being able to teach because you want female teachers for whatever reason. And then for institutional implicit, you could set up tests that could be bias in nature, that those of color or males would fail.
For culture, some of you probably know that Harvard University and a number of others have actually begun to be very measured or not take into consideration some of the tests that we've taken as being long-standing examples of entrance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's very, very important. Yeah.
And then moving on the individual explicit, of course, somebody in, whether it's a teacher, principal, parent, using derogatory racial or gender statements. And then the last is just a parent asking for a specific teacher because they want this to be their teacher, but they not know they may be having an underlying bias of why to choose this teacher over another teacher.
Good examples, great examples. Anybody else want to share an example to fit any of these categories, or before we move on? Yes.
I'll show a personal one about individual explicit. I started at Wayne State way back when. And I got a job at physical education at the Mathi building. Some of you might, okay. I was probably one of the first student assistants that had to go upstairs and use the copier machine. And back then it was a steno. Some of you nodding your head, you know. Yeah. So, and yes, you know, all the stick, oh yeah, all of that. That's what I had to use. So, right. Yeah. So, I guess it was like the head secretary, Loretta, says to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm getting supplies, making some copies for Coach Dilworth." And she says, "Who gave you a key?" And I says, "Coach Dilworth." "Well, I don't know if you should have that key." And I was like, "Well, the previous student had it." "Well, you're not the previous student." So I found out I was the first African-American student who could do this job and had a key, and it was a concern of hers. So I says, "Well, I have it. I'm going to do the job. Is there something I can help you with?" And she looked at me like, "I was just nasty to you. Why are you asking me that?" So every time I would go upstairs, I stopped by Loretta's office. I said, "Hey, Loretta, I'm going to make some copies. Do you need anything?" Because I had to walk right past her office, so I stopped in. No. And then finally, after months and months, she said, "Yeah, I could use some help." And then it was hilarious when she came downstairs. She was getting ready to retire. And she says, "Dee, I'm retiring. Have you heard?" I said, "Yeah, I heard you're moving to Florida, blah, blah, blah." And she says, "And I've talked to Dr. Whitehouse, and I have recommended that you take my job." And I'm like, "Wow, that is very nice of you, Loretta, but I think my parents will have a fit if I was to be a secretary after they paid for my college education. Well, thank you very much." She turned around and she went right back to the very first place she started 2 years ago. She wouldn't talk to me and anything like that. But honestly, back in those days, I don't think she thought it was an issue.
I was going to say, she probably didn't even realize she was insulting.
Exactly. I don't think she thought it was an issue, but she certainly thought my not taking her job was one.
Thank you. All right. We'll press on. All right. And I believe this is your slide. So,
we've already kind of walked through this because we've been talking about bias. And so we just want to provide some framing around definitions, because all of us come into this space and come into this room with the definitions from our own schools of thought and from our own trainings. And so we want to offer this up as some proposed definitions that could be used as a common group, as a shared group. So individual racism is really about bigotry and discrimination person to person. And this is often what gets talked about and blown up in the news, right? This is generally what makes headlines and what gets ratings. But what isn't often talked about in the news is institutional racism, which is really about the policies, practices, and procedures that favor a particular group over another. And when you think about institutional racism, it really is, for us, about specific institutions. So I think about places of business, places of worship, places of play, and places of learning. Those are the institutions that we think about when we think about institutional racism. And they have the power to adversely affect and or harm the lives of a particular population of people. And then structural racism is a web or a network of institutions that create a system of adverse effects or harm against a particular population or group of people. So now we're going to move into a scenario and give you an opportunity to play a couple of roles. And so we'll need some volunteers. And I'm going to tell you what the names of the roles are. And Gordon, if I could ask you to write down who agrees to be who.
you got it?
So we have the role of Andy. And Andy is actually leading a conversation, facilitating a conversation with the city. Looks like we need a narrator as well. So I'll start there. We have a narrator. Any takers on narrator?
I'll be the narrator.
Thank you. So then we have Andy, who is a representative from the city, and he's facilitating this conversation. Tough job. Then we have, who would like to be Andy? Excellent. Thank you so much. Then we have Patty, and Patty is a resident. Would someone like to be Patty? Great, thank you. We also have Officer Milton, who's representing the City Police Department. Excellent, thank you.
I don't have a tag, but you spell my name Leigh.
Excellent. And tell us your name again, I'm sorry. Kyle, thank you. Then we have Eduardo. And Eduardo, I believe, is also a resident. Thank you. Yes. Wait, what?
Oh, you going
Did
back?
someone, did you see someone? No. Okay. Okay.
It does,
Okay. Who's volunteering to be Eduardo?
doesn't matter. I can be Eduardo or Kyle.
Thank
I
you.
could have a
Okay.
deep voice.
We have Eduardo. Tell us your name again.
D.
D. And then I skipped Nick. Who would like to be Nick? Thank you. Tell us how to spell your name.
It could be Nikki.
Nancy.
Yeah.
Nick is Nancy.
That was implicit. That was implicit.
And now we need a Laverne. Are we running out of people? Great.
I'm sure like.
There you go. Does everyone have a role?
No, I think.
Will you be Darlene?
Darlene, yeah. Well, I was in the hall. Am I supposed to read this stuff? We're
Yes.
playing?
Yes, we're role playing. Yep, you got it. You got it.
I'll be the audience.
Well, we need someone to be,
Who am I again?
yeah, you are Darlene.
Okay.
Darlene.
And so we need you to be Laverne, right? Is that who you were? We don't have everyone listed, so can we just make sure that we have enough? It's Carol. And Darlene, tell me your name again. Jeff. Awesome. Okay, let's get started with our narrator.
I'm not this way.
All right.
Okay, recent media reports have highlighted the changing demographics in many neighborhoods. A newly proposed subsidized housing complex has led to tension in one neighborhood. A community meeting is taking place to discuss the new housing and the public safety concerns expressed by some residents. Andy from the city is facilitating the conversation, and 2 city staffers are here to help respond to questions. Laverne, who works in planning and zoning, and Officer Melton, who is a police officer in the neighborhood. The manager for the new complex, Eduardo, is also in the room. The room is packed with meeting participants, clearly divided, including Patty and Nick, who are opposed to the housing, and Darlene, who has been on the wait list for housing for 8 months and is eager to move in.
Welcome to tonight's discussion. I want to start by sharing a few of the results of the recently released Community Equity Profile, Housing. As stated in that profile, our vision is that we have an adequate amount of safe and affordable housing for all income groups. The data collected in the profile illustrates that we have work to do, especially since there are big differences based on race. 10% of whites pay more than 50% of their income on housing, as do 36% of blacks and 27% of Asians. There's just is not enough affordable housing for people who need it. The city has approved the permits for the new project, and we're excited that this new housing will be able to close that gap. We also understand there have been a lot of concerns expressed about the safety of the neighborhood. We want to talk tonight about how this new project can benefit both the new neighbors and the existing neighbors. Thanks to everyone who signed up to share your perspectives. We have 2 hours scheduled and 50 people who would like to speak. That means you need to keep your comments short. And let's start at the top of the list with Patty.
I can't believe the city approved this project. This is in the middle of a single-family neighborhood. Having all these people move into our neighborhood means an increase of crime and more traffic. This just isn't right. The city has to stop.
Nick is next.
I've already seen an increase in loitering, and you know that those people are dealing drugs. Our children are not safe. If this project gets built, I'm not sure I will even want to keep my children in our local schools. It has always been a good school up until now. I want to know what the police are going to do.
Ben is next.
Wait, I said I want to know what the police are going to do. Can't Officer Melton respond? He works in this neighborhood, and I want to know what he thinks. Officer Melton?
Well, I used to work at one of the other complexes, and when people missed too many months of rent, I was the one who had to evict them. I hated to do that, but that was what they had to be done. We used to have a social services aide who tried to help people get assistance, but when there wasn't any assistance, I just had to put their stuff out on the street. That's not why I signed up to be a police officer.
See, he works for the city, and he doesn't even like it.
We need to get back to the list. There are a lot of people who want to speak.
Sure, in a minute, but we need to know how this project is going to be managed. What are they going to do to keep our neighborhoods safe?
Safety is our #1 concern. We will be doing criminal background checks to make sure that nobody with a record moves into our project. As you can see by the design poster in the back, this will be a pretty project, and we want to keep it that way.
And what about this permit approval? That doesn't seem right. Laverne, what did you have to do with that? Was that some sort of buy-off?
Yes. No, this is a good project, and I can tell you more details.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I didn't know I was going to have to wait 2 hours to say something. I rushed here after work to pick up my kids up at their child care program. It's about to close. I really need housing. I've been paying 2/3 of my paycheck for rent. I can't even pay other bills some months. I'm trying hard to make it, but I just can't when the pay is so low. I have to go now, but I would like to be a part of this neighborhood.
All right.
Academy Award for sure.
Yes. Thank you all for having so much fun with this. That was great. So give you a couple minutes in your pair, and then we'll share out with the larger group. Underline some of the places where you see examples of implicit bias and individual, institutional, and structural racism within the scenario. So give you about 2 minutes, 3 minutes to do that with a partner.
And the time expires now. Thank you. So we'll ask you to come back. I know that one group is finishing up their conversation. But where do you see individual signs of individual racism in this scenario?
From the individual speaking,
Any particular instance that you underlined?
Patty has an issue.
Okay. What is her specific issue? What did she say? Is there something she said that?
She feels like this complex is going to interfere with the culture of the neighborhood.
Okay. All
They're
right.
single family.
All right.
Who are
Okay.
these people?
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So these people, please, thank you very much. Any other signs of individual racism, nuanced, or Nick? Okay. Yep. Those people. Okay. All right. Yes.
I have a comment too. Those people, there's people that are poor that are white too.
Yes, that's very true. Yes. So, those people can be an othering that's associated by race, by class. We don't really know. We can make some inferences, right, about. Well, as are we all. Let us all own that. But in this instance, it very well could be race too, right? So. And it could be class. So institutional racism, where do you see some signs of policies, practices, procedures that work better for white people than people of color? Maybe unintentionally or inadvertently.
Well, based on the setup we're looking at, I'm sorry, just when Andy opened up the meeting with, what's going on, I'm sorry. When Andy opened up the meeting with context, like, okay, this is what's going on and this is why we're even looking at affordable housing, because there's a huge discrepancy in what our citizens are paying. And Niles has this issue as well.
So that could be an institutional sort of recognition. Other institutional signs of institutional racism?
Our group had Officer Melton's practice of evicting those that didn't pay rent.
Okay, all right.
A mandatory practice.
Question?
Question was it the police officer, or was that told what he had to do for his job? Because he said, I don't like doing this. So he had no choice.
Yeah, eviction procedures often involve some set of law enforcement actors, right? So, yes. Did you have a?
Just in his sense, so it could be structural in that sense too. It's part of his given job,
Right. So that's where law enforcement intersects with a court system, which is making a determination, right? So, and there could be a number of other reasons why the rent isn't being paid, right? So yeah, other institutional or structural.
It had to say they're doing background checks to make sure that nobody with a record moves into the property.
Right. So we're already familiar with what a zero tolerance policy can mean in terms of excluding people from housing. That's been something that's been part of the Federal Housing Administration for a little while now, right? So if it's a misdemeanor, is that keep you from getting housing? I mean, which may keep you from having a roof over your head or employment? Yeah.
I own apartments, we do criminal checks. So, I mean, I don't think it's any form of racism whatsoever.
Okay. Well, and so the way that criminal checks begin to create barriers, though, may inadvertently have a more negative impact for communities of color. Might not. It depends on the context. But when you think about where enforcement takes place, if somebody gets 3 tickets for marijuana, is that really something that should keep them from being employed or having a job? Some of you may, I don't know if Michigan had a ban the box effort in terms of when you were seeking employment, getting rid of the box that says, you know, I have a conviction, right? That certainly happened in some other jurisdictions, and it's a recognition that generally most Americans believe that if you have done a crime, but you've also done the time to pay for your crime, you should, you know, if it's not necessarily a capital murder or something, have an opportunity to re-enter society. So, just another example. We'll take one more and then we're going to move on.
But Officer Milton did also identify an issue within his statement because he would say, we used to have a social services. Where'd they go?
Yeah.
Budget cut.
Right. That may reflect change in priorities. It may reflect reallocation of resources. It certainly does speak to the fact that Officer Milton is only one aspect of an institution, right, that's impacting this situation. He may have been teamed with somebody else before. His role, though, is, you know what, I have this eviction order. Here's what I do, you know? So he's not a social services person. So we're going to talk about using a racial equity tool, and we're going to talk about it, but then ask you to use it for 2 specific questions. So a racial equity tool is really about a process and a product. The process is about a thinking process. It begins to intervene whenever you are getting ready to make decisions about funding, about program design, about where you make changes to particular programs, hiring, advancement. What you're really doing is you're inserting a racial equity analysis into a particular situation. So the product aspect of it is really in terms of the outcome that you get from that, how that changes what you normally do within an organization where you have policies but a lot of practices, which usually dictate how something is determined. Next slide. Show you a little bit about what the process looks like, and please know that there is a fairly detailed document on the GARE website about the racial equity tool. This is depicted as a linear process, but it's really somewhat circular. There are usually some feedback loops between some of the different levels. The first level is number 1 because it's most important in terms of priorities. Knowing what your desired result is absolutely crucial to using this process well. If you can't articulate what the desired result is, for instance, our desired result is to have a snow removal policy that doesn't unintentionally penalize people who have left their car on the street, right? We have a big issue in the Twin Cities around having towing occur whenever there is an emergency for snow. It's a public health safety issue when you can't get the streets plowed because it means that fire equipment and emergency equipment can't get down the streets. But getting your car towed and impounded is at the very least about a $600 experience and can go much, much higher than that, higher than the cost, than the value of the vehicle. And it can really penalize people in ways that prevent them from getting to work, education, health, a number of other issues. So understanding that a desired result for the city of St. Paul is understanding how we begin to do this snow removal in emergencies by and do it well, so that people have other options about where they put their cars and stuff. Really, really important. Having some data is also important. So just like in the example with the property owners, where there was some data collected about their own experience of who received different treatment based upon their race, it's important to have that data for government as well. So it may be the case that one of the more important, I'll just say, legacies of the work of GARE is that a lot more jurisdictions are collecting data and collecting it based on race so that they can understand if there are some differences that people of different races are experiencing when they're working with government, right? Because if you don't have that data, if you're not collecting it, you don't have any trends, you're really just sort of going on impressions. Community engagement, also important. But the engagement aspect of this is more than community outreach. So if we find ourselves developing solutions or even developing the agenda for what a solution path might be without having involvement from the people who are most directly impacted by our actions, we're bound to make mistakes. Anytime we have like a unilateral agenda going out there about here's what we're proposing to change, it's probably not going to match up directly with some of the priorities of the people we're actually trying to help. So that community engagement aspect is a longer-term relationship. It takes time to develop that, and that means that it's not resource independent, right? It has to become part of the way you do your work, right? That begins to inform how we begin to develop the strategies. Many of us, when a problem comes up, and we think we've identified it, we want to jump to strategies for racial equity. These 3 steps help us to get clearer about what the strategies can be. An implementation plan, just like we talked about with desegregation in the schools, is really important to understanding what are some of the possible unintended consequences that could occur if we actually go ahead and do this. What do we need to pay particular care and attention to focus on and avoid if we move forward with this plan? And the communications and accountability is both necessary internally as well as externally to the audiences that we're really trying to help or partners that we need to engage in doing the work well. So that's just familiarity with that level of thinking. Here's what we'd like you to do. We have 2 questions. We need a discussion group around using the racial equity tool, and we'll put it back on the screen, about the possible inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity within the meaning of sex. So thinking about that as an expanded definition, if you will. How might a racial equity framework inform this topic, right? So that's group 1. Group 2 is around intersectionality. Where's the intersection of race, education, and civil rights in K through 12 settings? All right, how might a racial equity framework address this issue? For the first question, question A, sexual orientation and gender identity need, there are 8 of us here, or 9? 1, 2, 3, 9, okay. Who would like to be in this group? Group A? Yes. All right, 1. We need at least 3 more.
This end is going to take the first question.
Gotcha. All right. By Fia, you intuited that, right?
There's 4 and 4, right? Are you going to help us?
Yeah, I can stay with this one.
Okay.
Sure. And in this group, we're going to go with question B, the intersection of race, education, and civil rights in K through 12 settings, and how a racial equity framework would help to address this issue. We'll put that slide back up and take, let's go about for 5 minutes to start thinking about how a racial equity tool might be helpful to us in framing this. All right, I'm going to ask you to come back to our shared discussion. I realize you've got a fair amount of energy around going deeper with using this analysis. How far did you get? Did you get to the point of...
We made peace in the Middle East.
Okay. So in terms of a desired result...
You mean you and I are going to be friends?
What's the desired result that you all came to for the question you were taking?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know if we ever got a chance to articulate that. Yes, we were defining that articulation because it was expressed that we don't want anybody to be discriminated against. And then we were also talking about City of East Lansing and their marketplace policy has actually been overturned by a federal court. So now you've got people's religious protection being discussed. So these issues are alive and well in today's session.
Which is also being appealed. I think they're
Right.
going to appeal.
So the decision will keep being appealed. Yeah, absolutely. So we are in the clash of that today when you look at how do you articulate non-discriminatory and religious protection, because as we were saying, you would like to have both.
Yeah, you're trying to find that healthy balance and tension around that. Okay, great. What about here? How far did you get with articulating a desired result? Anybody from, it seems like you were almost in a consultative space with your group. What are you walking away with an understanding about?
Well, I came for education and answer, so we just spoke about some of the concerns in my home district and how I feel like this training is very, very valuable, relative and pertinent to my district right now, but it's how do I convince my board, because it starts with us and then it trickles down to the rest of the organization.
And some of the thoughts you got about that from your team members were what? What are you walking away with in terms of some takeaways from that about how to start that conversation?
She has her information. She just
I have the data.
And she's already included the community of students and teachers. She is now at the point, in my opinion, is getting that board to come over and see the light almost of what is really happening and what really needs to happen.
So there might be some strategizing that you do around what's the best way to leverage. Whenever you've got students, then you've probably got parents. Whenever you combine students with parents, usually there's some accountabilities that people want to exhibit. So it may be just crafting that opportunity for parents and students to come together in support of it.
It's the stakeholders in the district.
Yeah, there you go. Well, great. So this was just a taste of how to begin incorporating a racial equity analysis into some policies and practices at the institutional level. We've come to the end of our time together today, but we encourage you as you continue to do your work as a commission to, number one, in terms of normalizing. We just started that process today, talking about some terms and some concepts to talk about race. Don't let this be the last time that you have that conversation. We're going to ask you to fill out the evaluation on the last sheet, and you can leave that with Augie. Yep, you can leave them right up here, and we'll be here to answer any questions that you might have.